Well, good morning, everyone. How are we all on this sultry Tuesday? I am John Mann, Director of Education for Lakeside. And for this year, of course, we're celebrating the cultural and geographic regions of the United States. And during week 6 of the lecture series, we'll explore the region of the U.S. known as New England. This is the region known for its rich colonial history, coastal towns, and many prestigious institutions of higher learning. And we are fortunate that Jay Case is here today to share the history of the Common School movement, which originated in New England. Jay is a professor of history at Malone University in Canton, and he received his MA and PhD in American history from the University of Notre Dame. Jay concentrates his teaching, publishing, and research in the areas of American religious history and evangelicalism. And Jay will return today at 3:30 for another session titled New England and Equality in America. I would ask if you would please mute your cell phone ringers if you haven't already, and help me in welcoming Dr. Jay Case.
Thank you very much, John. It's just a joy to be in this community, Lakeside, Chautauqua. So many good things going on here. My wife and I really love visiting here. Talking about New England and education, we have to start, we're going to start with some philosophy, turn to some philosophers, Hobbes and Calvin. Yeah, not Thomas Hobbes or John Calvin, although they both did have some good and interesting and important things to say about education, but the iconic comic strip, Thomas and Hobbes. So here we go, to explore this question. Oh, and why am I, there we go. All right, so here is Calvin standing on the corner waiting for the school bus. He's got his lunchbox beside him, and Calvin says, I don't want to go to school. I don't want to know anything new. I already know more than I want to. I like things better when I didn't understand them. The fact is, I'm being educated against my will. My rights are being trampled. Is it a right to remain ignorant? I don't know, but I refuse to find out. Now, I have to admire Calvin here. This is a great rhetorical strategy for a problem that he sees in his life. He's being educated against his will. That's true. He does not want to go. He's forced to go. And so the Americans do this sometimes when they don't like how things are going. They say, isn't this a right that's being violated? My rights have been violated. That's a great rhetorical strategy. We Americans do that a lot of times. Some things are rights. Some things are not rights. We can get confused on what really is right, but that's a discussion for another time, right? Is it a right to remain ignorant? Actually, in the United States, no. That is not a right. And Calvin is locked in on something very American here with this language of rights. He's locked in on this concept of freedom. Something we ought to think about more deeply here as we're approaching the 250th anniversary of our nation. And Calvin points out a very real tension or conflict embodied in this word freedom. We Americans believe in liberty and limited government and the freedom of individuals to make choices, in rights, in allowing people to live lives the way we want. And so we give people great freedom to do all sorts of things, right? You are free right now, if you want to get up, leave this room, go out, get into your Toyota Highlander and drive to Colorado and sit on the side of a mountain and wait for snow and skiing season. If you want to, you could do that. You have the right to use all of your disposable income for a hobby, whatever it is that it consumes your passion, like, I don't know, locating and buying and collecting old, worn-out Radio Shack cassette players. Yeah. You have the right, you even have the right in the United States to form your own religion based on whatever. You could create a religion based on Mexican food and gather followers to worship black beans and the great and mighty avocado. If you want to, you could do that. None of us had the right, however, to be ignorant. We were forced to go to school. So, everybody, right, from the age of 5 to 16. What an interesting conflict we have in the United States between freedom and forcing everyone to go to school, some sort of school. It doesn't have to be public school. It could be a private school. You could be homeschooled, but it does have to be school. And we believe this because we believe that school is good for Calvin, no matter what he thinks. And sometimes we forget this part. Sending Calvin to school is good for American society. Even if Calvin is stubborn and ornery, as he is, I say yes. Send him off to school. Let Miss Wormwood deal with his orneriness, and maybe she can, do something with him. And so we get, here's Miss Wormwood. Calvin, would you demonstrate the next problem at the board? Yes, Miss Wormwood, I would be happy to do anything you ask. I have been successfully programmed to obey all directives. I have no will of my own. And off he goes to the principal's office. Doesn't anybody appreciate theater? God bless the Miss Wormwoods of this nation. They have a job to do dealing with people like Calvin. But I think it's worth diving into thinking about how we got to this place we are in, where we make everybody go to school. And Calvin voices a question that every fourth grader probably has asked silently or aloud, sometimes maybe loudly. Why do we have to go to school? Why does the government make us go to school? And the answer is because of New England, or more specifically, the Puritans. Well, that's the simplified answer. It's more complicated than that, but we'll start with there. So we need to start by looking at the Puritans and some of the background here with Puritans. And let's see, we'll just do it this way. Between 1630 and 1640, a lot of Puritans migrated to America, specifically to New England, 20,000 in a 10-year period, which for that time was a lot, all at once. There were a lot of Puritans who stayed behind in England, mainly in East England, East Anglia, and were very similar to these Puritans that came to America. But 20,000 come, and what the Puritans in New England had that the Puritans back in England did not have was a lot more freedom to set up a society the way they wanted to. There's an unfortunate aspect of dealing with the Native Americans. Actually, many of them had died of disease before the Puritans even landed. That's another unfortunate part of the story. But with the Native Americans being not much of a problem, the Puritans in New England could set up their community the way they wanted to. More freedom than they had in England. Well, what did they want? We have to go back to some theology here. Here's where we do get into the real John Calvin. An important part of their Calvinism was a belief in the sovereignty of God, that God had ultimate power and control over the world. Most famously, for Calvinists, this ends up in the doctrine of predestination. That's what most everybody thinks of or remembers when they think of Calvinist theology. But they were pretty sure that they could identify how God moved in the world, at least in a lot of different events. And part of their belief was that God brings good things to people. He blesses them. He provides provides human beings with food and health and peace, especially, the Puritans believed, good Christian people. But sometimes he also brought punishments when people did bad things. And the punishments could be actually to an entire group of people in the form of a drought or a disease like smallpox. Or, if you're in New England, if the Native Americans attacked. They often believed that was God's punishment on themselves. So when does God bless and when does he bring punishment? Well, that comes down to their theology of a covenant, right? A covenant is an agreement between human beings and God. Both sides have obligations. It's just that God always upholds his obligations, and the Puritans believed humans very often broke their obligations. But the Puritans viewed themselves as the children of Israel, and like the Old Testament covenants and relationships with God worked the same way with their body collectively as with God. And so, like the Israelites, if they did what is good and they were virtuous, God would bless them. In fact, he's obligated to bless them. That's God upholding his part of the bargain. He will, bring them peace and enough food through the winter and prosperity and happiness and so forth. But if the Puritans fall, then judgment will come and, the Indians will attack. Now, it gets a little more complicated than that because the Puritans believe, everybody will sin and will fall. The problem is you need to repent properly, and God will withhold his judgment. And then there are some people who will not be godly. They just will not repent or do what is good. So it is our responsibility as a community, this is another part of the covenant called the National Covenant, to punish anybody who will not change their ways. So otherwise, smallpox will come through the whole neighborhood. So, what does my neighbor do? Is it my business? If you're a Puritan, yes, that's my business. If they're out of line, I might get it from God, who knows? A hurricane will hit, or who can say what? They took this very, very seriously. So people need to be godly, but if they're not godly, they at least need to hold to what is right and wrong. All right, now, there's a relationship between this and school. To illustrate this, let's think about a child going off to school in Puritan New England in, say the 1640s. Let's take this little girl. We will call her Prudence. I could call her Mary or Elizabeth or Sarah. Those are the most popular names for girls if you're Puritan. But they also had some of these other names that are odd that we don't use today, like Prudence. And that just seems more fun to me. Plus, prudence means good judgment and wisdom. And that's what the Puritans were aiming for. So little 6-year-old Prudence goes off to school, and she's going to learn how to read. And as we all probably did when we learned how to read, you get a book that helps you sound out the letters and their sounds, right? A is for, because A is always for apple, right? And B can be a number of different things, bat or ball, and C is often for cat. Well, Prudence has a book like this also, called a primer. And so she's going to learn her alphabet. And guess what? A is not always for apple. No, in the Puritan primer, A is for Adam. Yes, in Adam's fall, we sinned all. And B is for book or Bible. Thy life to mend this book attend. And C is for cat, because C is always for cat, even for the Puritans. The cat doth play and after slay. D is for dog, because it's always for dog. A dog will bite a thief at night. E, an eagle's flight is out of sight. F, the idle fool is whipped at school. Ooh, that F's a tough one. The idle fool is whipped at school. Prudence decides to develop good judgment early on, and so she does not be idle. She works at what she is doing to be a good student, so she will not be whipped at school or spanked or however they work. But anyway, you have this primer that Prudence. So you notice that Prudence is learning more than just the alphabet, isn't she? She is learning theology at a very early age. In Adam's fall, we sinned all. People are sinful. That's a key part of Reformed Calvinist, total depravity. but also Bible. Thy life to mend, this book attend. Prudence is learning that you better pay attention to the Bible. The Bible is very important for these sorts of things. But there's a question here. Oh, I should also mention, because the Puritans were very strict and they would punish people for all kinds of things that today we don't necessarily punish them for in terms on a government level, like adultery. If your neighbor's committing adultery, the Puritans, we have examples, they turn their neighbors in and they testify against them. They feel like we have to do this. Why? Because the Indians will attack if we don't do that. You know, you can't go skating on the Sabbath, you'll fall through the ice, and that's God's punishment or something like that. But also they have this other side to them in their theology. I just want to mention this so we don't get too much of a stereotype, that is about this warm spirituality. My book and heart shall never part. And if you read Puritan devotional writings and journals, you find that they are people a lot like us, and they have spiritual questions and things they are dealing with. There's some passages I've read, like a young man who feels like he is justified and has salvation, but he looks around him and other people have these like emotional experiences and he does not, and so he has doubts. So he goes to God to try to, and God reassures him. Or a man whose baby is really, really sick and may be dying, and goes and prays to God for help and assistance. Anyway, they are people like us in many ways and have the ups and downs of life that come through here. But the part of the question we want to ask is this: well, why is prudence in school in the first place? And this is where we put the New England Primer together with covenant theology, and the answer starts to unfold for us, and you've probably figured a lot of this out by now. But the part of the idea is the Puritans say, if we are going to have a godly society, then people have to know the Bible. And who has to know the Bible? Answer: everyone. And so everyone needs to learn how to read so they can read the Bible. Or everyone should know how to read, or at least respect people who know to read. And so therefore, we're going to send little John and little Roger and little Samuel to school, but we're also going to send Prudence and Mary and Sarah off to school so that they can become godly people. And not only do they say, these people need to go to school, because many of them will. Prudence, because her name is Prudence, will dutifully go to school. Calvin, I don't know, right? Now, maybe Calvin's parents will force him to go to school, but sometimes parents are slackers. And so what do we got? And so the Puritans, in good Puritan fashion, passed laws to make all this happen. Let's have a law. And so in 1647, the colony of Massachusetts passed what's called the Old Deluder Law, named after Satan. Yes, Satan, the devil, this is a law named after him because the Puritans said Satan will delude people into thinking if they don't read the Bible, people will be deluded by all kinds of things and do crazy sort of things. They don't know what's good for them. Puritans would appreciate Calvin standing there saying, why do I have to go to school? And Puritans say, see, this kid needs to go to school. Because Satan will, that's how they, to the Puritans, Satan was a very, very real person. And so they passed a law saying that every town over the size of 50 families must have a teacher to teach children. Now this part, later this will come, but this part didn't require all the children to go to school, but every town had to provide school, and there was deep encouragement. Puritans knew how to encourage. The idle fool is whipped at school. You go to school. But every town needed to set this up. And so every town over 50 had a teacher who had to know Greek and Latin. I would not be qualified to be a third grade teacher, even though I have a PhD in Puritan New England, because I don't know Greek or Latin. And if a town was more than 100 people, They had to have actually not just a teacher there someplace, they had to actually have a school. So you put all this together and you realize that for the Puritans, there is this strong religious motivation, but it is for the good of the whole community in their way of thinking. If you'd asked a Puritan, ask a Puritan legislator, what are you doing with these schools? Are you trying to, make good American citizens? They would have said, number one, what's an American? Do you mean the Indians? Because they say, we're English. Number two, what's a citizen? Because they were subjects. I'm going to talk more about this later this afternoon. They didn't consider themselves citizens. No, we're subjects of the king. We don't like the king a lot of times because he doesn't have good Puritan theology, but we are subjects of the king. And so it was not so much for the nation or the nation of Great Britain as for their religious community that they set up. They're trying to form a godly community. Now, there are consequences that are sort of unintended to this business. Some of them are good, and some unintended consequences to turn out. We usually use that negative, don't we? Unintended consequences. Uh-oh, something bad happened. But there are good unintended consequences, and one unintended consequence of this was Puritan New England ended up with some of the highest literacy rates in the world, rivaled only by a section of East Anglia where English Puritans were and parts of Prussia. But they ended up with a very, very high percentage of their people learning how to read. And part of the reason why the Puritans ended up with such high literacy rates is because they ended up with the highest literacy rates for women. Little girls have to go to school also. Now, here's one thing to realize about education. We have, and let's just talk about literacy. Literacy has been around for millennia, right? For 4,000 years. Go back to ancient India and Mesopotamia and ancient China and Egypt, and cuneiform and so forth. You have different forms of writing that have existed. But for roughly 3,500 years, up to about this time, the only people really could read were the elites. The royal families, the high educators. The vast majority of people could not read, and they were not taught to read, and it was impractical. They have to, produce the food, and you don't have the technology to produce, books and pages like we had. So literacy was, in many ways, a privilege of the people at the top of the ladder in society, and also was a way for them to hold on to their power, too. People like when they get power to hold on to it. It's really hard to give up power. But what you have here, and the Puritans weren't necessarily thinking this way, but they are giving a certain amount of power to a lot of common, ordinary people by teaching them how to read, including females. So that leads to another unintended consequence of teaching girls how to read. Oh, like Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson is an unintended consequence. I don't know if you know the story of Anne Hutchinson. She actually had immigrated to Massachusetts from England, but she had learned to read in England because among the Puritans in that area, they were also teaching girls how to read. And I should go back one step and mention that part of Puritan spiritual practices were not only that you read the Bible, but there are other spiritual practices that you ought to take place in. They encouraged people, for instance, to journal, write out prayers to God, and so forth. They encouraged people to have family devotions. The father should get together and you should read the Bible and memorize scripture and things like that. They encouraged what we might call small groups. Get people together collectively to study the Bible. All this outside of church. They encouraged people to go to church too, like you really had to go to church. But they had all these other sort of spiritual practices, some of which still continue among different religious communities today. And One consequence of this was Anne Hutchinson, because she ran a Bible study. We would call it that. She would, on Sunday, gather people together and talk about the sermon. And apparently she was A, pretty bright, and B, a pretty charismatic figure. She was compelling, and she started attracting a lot of women to her Bible studies. And then she began attracting men to her Bible studies. That's interesting if you think about gender dynamics in 1637. And that was all fine, because this is an example of good Puritan spirituality and godliness and so forth, until she began to make some theological points where she disagreed with a lot of the Puritan ministers in town. Oops. She was in Boston, and she had a different take. She actually was, I won't go into this, she's sort of a hyper-Calvinist in terms of not just predestination, but good works don't matter at all. God saves who he wants to save and damns who good works aren't even a sign of salvation. Anyway, it was a point of doctrine that, number one, the ministers disagreed with, but also number two, she was building this following and challenging them. And it got a bit out of hand, and they called her to a trial with the ministers in town. And it was a two-day sort of question and answer period. I mean, they didn't just, she's a witch, burn her, that kind of, stereotype we get of the Puritans. They actually had a trial and to talk about theology and what she believed and so forth. And as they were moving further and further and kind of pinning her down, they asked her, well, where did you get this belief? A particular point. And she said, well, the Holy Spirit revealed it to me. Okay, that's it. Because her implication was, the Holy Spirit is talking to me in a way that he's not talking to the other ministers. And they said, she is out of line, and they kicked her out of the colony. She actually went south to what was Rhode Island, where they kicked out another Puritan minister, Roger Williams, who went to Rhode Island and set up religious freedom. It was a good place for her to go. That's another story for another day. But my point is this, about this unintended consequence. You teach people to read, and there's a good chance they're going to, not Prudence, she's towing the line. But Anne, you're going to challenge the authorities on something, and you're going to have a debate. So Puritan society was interesting because the authority politically and socially was top down and pretty strict. But at the same time, they encouraged this spirituality through literacy and Bible reading that was bottom up. Now, they managed to work things out more or less for quite a while after this. So we're going to jump ahead to a later time when there are some rapid changes in education. And jump ahead to 1776, when at that time, 80% of women in New England could read, which is really, again, that's kind of like a global high. That's a pretty remarkable number, especially because by this time, well, the Puritans are gone. They're kind of replaced by Yankees, Congregationalists, and Unitarians, but also there are Anglicans and Quakers and kind of free thinkers. It's now a little bit more diverse than what it was. But you have women who can read, for instance, Abigail Adams. We heard a little bit about, if you were here last night, John Adams talking about Abigail Adams. But New England had a very high literacy rate even to that day, and especially among women. And this is where things start to change for women in regards to education. Up through the 19th century, women in New England read and read more and more and more as the economy grew and you could produce more and more books. And women became writers at a much greater rate. So that if you jump ahead, to Louisa May Alcott, who publishes Little Women, really about her growing up in the 1860s. If you know this book or you've seen the movies or both, you find this family is just so immersed in reading and writing. That is such a key part of who they are. And that's Louisa May Alcott's story. She is, right, Jo March, who grows up to become a writer herself, who sells books. And there was even a big market. A lot of it was romance books. In the 1850s, one of the best sellers was The Wide, 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 Wide World. How many of you have read The Wide, 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 Wide? Yeah, there's a reason you haven't. But it was kind of a romance in the 1850s, which was a good romance book. But, well, let's just say there's a reason why people today read Little Women, but they don't read The Wide, 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 Wide World. It just hasn't survived. But a lot of women were reading and writing. And so literacy is important. But there's more than that going on. You also get this shift in New England among who is teaching. And between 1810 and 1840, you get a shift from almost every primary school teacher before this was male. You get a few exceptions, like Abigail Adams, who on her own, because she's a strong-minded, bright person who, set up that school that John talked about last night. But you get almost every primary school teacher was a male. Two, by 1840, in New England now, female teachers outnumbering male teachers 2-1. Now, women have been reading in New England for 2 centuries. Why this shift? This is the kind of question that historians are interested in. I don't know if you are, but I am, so I'm going to talk about it. Why did you get this shift suddenly where women are becoming teachers when they weren't before? They are teaching much the same thing. By the way, here's the New England primer from 1777. There have been some adjustments. But there are some things that have not changed. In Adam's fall, we sinned all. Okay, that A is still for Adam. We haven't reached Apple yet. The heaven to find, the Bible mind, they changed the rhyme a little bit. Christ crucified for sinners died. That's the effect of the Great Awakening and even evangelical ideas of a conversion experience. The deluge drowned the earth around. Elijah hid by ravens fed. The judgment made Felix fair. Everything is theological here, interestingly enough. More than the Puritans directly. Okay, so that is still the same. Why do women become teachers, though? Okay, we have to go back a little bit to talk about the colonial era when men were in charge of the household. What does this mean when men were in charge? Okay, let me give you an example. In the 1740s, there were the equivalent of child raising manuals, parenting manuals, and they would write out, advice on, feeding and discipline and, clothes and raising children in a whole bunch of different ways and all sorts of, like Dr. Spock. Dr. Spock for the 1740s. And all of those books were addressed to men, to the husbands and to the fathers. Now, the fathers were not changing the diapers. The fathers were not, nursing the children. But the fathers were in charge. Now, the women could read, especially in New England, they could read. But the fathers would read them, and then they would instruct the women what to do in the household. We, I think, tend to think of the model, which we'll get to in a minute, where, like the woman is in charge of the household. Oh, no, not back then. The man was in charge of the household. And that's an important sort of context for what is going on here in terms of what is going to shift. Things change after the Revolution, and it's not, there's a lot of things that change. Some of it is ideas of equality. That's going to be part of it. But one of the biggest things that changes is economics. And like I said, there's a lot of things going on here at once, but I just want to follow this one path about economics. Gender roles, home and work. In the family farm, where was work and where was home? It's all around here, right? I mean, you step outside and that's work? But, the husband and the wife, it all spilled up. The wife would oftentimes go out. Sometimes the wife went out and farmed and harvested the rye. Sometimes she went out and milked the cow. The husband went out there too, but sometimes he came inside. He was a master of the household. He worked. You didn't have this sharp distinction like no male woke up on a family farm in 1740 and said, "Goodbye, honey, I'm going off to work." She'd say, "Yeah? Like, what's the deal?" Okay, that changes when the economy starts to expand in the early 19th century, what we call the market revolution. You've got increased transportation, the Erie Canal, and markets booming, and factories building up. And you get this rise of middle-class jobs that are not agricultural. And what happens with the middle-class jobs that are not agricultural is suddenly there becomes a distinction between home and work. The husband has a job as a clerk or an accountant down at the factory or down at the store, leaves the home, goes off to work. And at the end of the day, he comes home, the children run out and greet him, and like Ricky Ricardo coming into Lucille Ball, "Honey, I'm home," or Ward Cleaver, to June, "Honey, I'm home." That's where this started to form, because there's the idea that there's home and there's work, and they're two different spheres, whereas agriculturally, but also even in like little shops, like if you were a shoe keeper, your shop was in the back or on top, or you're a blacksmith or something like that. Home and work were just mixed together. Now there is this distinction. And so the husband goes off to work, he's gone all day. Who's in charge of home? The wife is now in charge of home, and now she suddenly has responsibilities, and she's making decisions that she didn't used to make when those child-rearing manuals told the husband, do this, to tell the wife, do this, do this, do it. Now she has to make a lot of decisions herself because the husband is gone. And so you get this idea, and some historians have called this the separate spheres, where the home is the woman's sphere. That's where she makes decisions about cooking and cleaning and changing the diapers and also educating the children and teaching them right from wrong and all of that sort of stuff. And this involved, especially with children, a lot of nurturing tasks. And women were, I think were always nurturing, but now they're making decisions about how to nurture without being ordered by the husband what to do. And so they're just, they're teaching little Johnny about right and wrong, and telling him, no, you have to go to school, and all these other sorts of things. Instilling morality. And some of that they will learn at school, but a lot of it they will learn at home. And so here at 1840 is the image of the middle. This is, by the way, I should say this. This is middle class New England. Working class, the dynamics were different. Working class, oftentimes the women was working outside the home. Farms are a bit different. The South is different. This is middle class New England, which is going to have influence on middle class in America. But you can see the mother with the child is teaching. But look at how she's teaching. I mean, it's sweet. She's got the arm around him. She's bending near to him. She's caring for him. There's a certain amount of love. And as she points out what him or her. It's hard to tell with those early Victorian clothes whether that's a boy or a girl. Maybe it's a girl. Anyway, the child. Boys often wore frilly things at that age. But anyway, you've got this loving sense of nurture and care in the image of what a woman should do. Meanwhile, Dad goes off to work where things are rough and tumble, no matter what he's in. If he's in business, sometimes you have to tell people, you're fired. If you're in politics, oh, let's not even go there. If you're in the pulpit, sometimes you have to discipline your congregation. I mean, it's just a lawyer. You got to, get tough with people. And so there's this sense that men do the very difficult sort of things, and the public sphere out there is competitive and rough, sometimes immoral, while the domestic sphere is the place of godliness, humility, charity, piety. This is in New England now in terms of how people are thinking. All right. Now, what does this have to do with school? Well, let's go back to a time before this. When you had men in primary schools, do you know what else you had? Well, of course, you had stern discipline and a lot of idle fools being whipped in schools because, you know, that's what F said if you're Puritan. I mean, it was taskmaster if you are a male teacher in the colonial era. When we get up to the 19th century, as the spheres are changing, you're going to get some new changes. And some of the leaders in leading these changes are people who belong to the Beecher family. Okay, now the Beechers. The one Beecher you probably all know is, that's right, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. She is there. That's Harriet. This is Lyman Beecher and his wife. He was probably the most famous minister in America in the early 19th century, led a lot of reform campaigns, was very influential at Yale, and because he lived in Connecticut, and politics and a whole bunch of other things. But you also have some other famous, or who would be, this is Henry Ward Beecher, who will become the most famous preacher in the 1870s. And over here you have Catherine Beecher. There's some other Beechers we could talk about, but you know, not all Beechers are created equal. So Catherine Beecher became a writer and a thinker. And she's looking at the situation, and she says women were naturally better teachers than men. And it's building on what she is observing out in society in New England. She wrote a number of works on this, one of them a treatise on domestic economy, where she argued that, she says, why are we having men teach little children? Because you know what men are like. They're out there in the pub. They're rough and tumble and very, very strict. Children need this love and nurturing and so forth. Not only that, and here's the interesting sort of step Catherine Beecher makes. If you're going to be teaching little children, you're going to be teaching boys, like Calvin. Calvin needs to learn submission and humility and love, so that when he goes out into the rough and tumble world, the public sphere is not an ungodly man, dog eat dog. What is the phrase? Dog bite dog, man eat man? Anyway, you know what I mean. Where the public sphere is not so terrible and rough and tumble. We need women to instill nurture and love and care into children. She said, women are responsible for the public health. And you know what she just did there? She just undermined separate spheres. Because she took the woman out of the home and said, women are responsible for the health of wider society. It's not just about the home, it's about raising future citizens. And so she said, women should be our public school teachers. Now, this movement had started before she wrote these books, but she is prominent enough that she advocates for it, that she really gives it a push. And it just seemed to make sense to a lot of people, in New England at least, in the New England middle class, that women should be school teachers. And so we get this, by 1840, the thought is, oh yeah, primary school teachers, women. Think back to your elementary school. I don't know if, did anybody in here have an elementary school where male teachers outnumbered females? One. That'd be interesting. I'd like to hear about that school because it was out of the ordinary, right? I remember going off to school. I had Mrs. Long for kindergarten. I had Mrs. Turfs for first grade. In second grade, Mr. Ronzone walked in. I said, what is this? I just assumed that all elementary school teachers were women. Suddenly we got this guy up here. Blew my mind. We had this tradition of female educators that grows out of this New England idea of, you know, you're teaching children morality and character and so forth because women, it was thought, were better than, Catherine Beecher argued, would be naturally better at this than men. And so we get what is a classic sort of cultural icon or cultural image in the 19th century, the Yankee schoolmarm. You know, if you're this is the one. Now, she is firm, but she's loving, right? And she's the one who's going to be teaching the children, not only at home, not just the mother at home, but in the public schools. And we have this image that pops up over and over again. Here's the schoolhouse in 1870. Children, what does that say? Love your parents. And there she is teaching, you know, the children, boys and girls. Interestingly enough, then, this also spreads to other jobs later, several decades later. Other jobs that involve love and care and nurturing and service to the nation. So you get nurses. That seems like a female job. Males are doctors, nurses are females. And over on the top left, social workers. People to go into the rough and tough cities and help out poor people in various ways. Secretaries. You know, the first telephone operators were men. And finally they said, this is not a good idea. Cleared them all out and brought in women because they were nicer. And not as rude. I don't know why that was necessarily so, but nevertheless, secretaries, you know, the boss is the male, but you have these jobs that are sort of now coded for quite a long time as female, and are still coded that way in some ways pretty strongly today, although that is starting to shift. But that grows out of the same impulse as the idea of a female being a teacher. And this, you can see, is spreading now beyond New England. Oh, here's another famous, well, I don't know famous, but a noteworthy image. I forgot about this one, from Harper's Weekly, one leading magazine in the 1870s and 80s. This is Jesus and Mary studying the Torah. It's very sweet, right? Here is young Jesus. You notice it's just like it's very similar to the previous earlier image I showed you. There is Mary. She's got her arm around them. They've got the Torah out. She's teaching him lovingly and nurturing. And over here is Joseph, you know, because he's a carpenter. It's wonderful in the sense of a certain kind of education that shows real care and love and concern for the child. And it is historically inaccurate. Sorry. Mary could not read. I mean, the reality is a poor peasant girl like Mary in ancient Israel. Women did not read at that time. Joseph probably can't read either. Probably Jesus learned how to read because Mary and Joseph took him to the local rabbi, and the rabbi taught Jesus. But this fits with a 19th century New England way of thinking about education and why women should be teachers. I was at a Presbyterian church in Columbus about a year ago, and they had a big stained glass window with much the same image of Mary teaching Jesus. And it was an old church, right, built in the 1880s or 1890s. Yeah, it's nice. But it didn't happen that way. But that is how New Englanders, middle-class New Englanders, are thinking at this time. And it is, in some ways, a step forward for women. Now, so there's the second big change is women becoming teachers. Here's the third main point I want to finally get to, what we call the common school movement. And this is where we make it mandatory. Pass laws making kids go to school. And the main driving force behind this is Horace Mann. Guess what state he is from? Massachusetts. Yes. Although he's not the only one behind this movement. You also have Calvin Stowe, husband of Harriet Beecher Stowe. He was from Connecticut, although he moved to Ohio. Both of them are pushing for, and their thought is, look, the United States as a nation needs everybody to be educated. It's this long New England Puritan impulse. Only now they're thinking about the American nation. They said if the American nation is going to be healthy, if we're going to maintain our republic, we have to have certain sort of character and virtue. And Parents can provide a lot of that, but you also need this in school, and people need to be able to go to school so they can be informed. And so Horace Mann leads, is the main push behind this, the common school movement, where in 1800, Massachusetts by that time did require every child to go to school. Very shortly after that, every other New England state followed. But Horace Mann said, it's not just New England. We need this across the entire country. And he leads a charge for states across the nation to, number one, require children to go to school. This is, you know, where Calvin can really, really get upset, I suppose, at the whole thing. And not only are kids going to go to school, but they also, Horace Mann set up, how do we also ensure that the education is good? Well, it has to be established by state legislatures. And so what they need to do is create a position like a state superintendent of school and a state board of education and teacher training schools and textbooks that are chosen by the state so that they are of high quality is the thinking behind this. And states need to pass laws saying you have to be in school for a minimum number of days during the year. It's not just a week and a half. This is what we have, isn't it? Largely. Now, you can go to private schools. We have other variations. But this is, Horace Mann really starts to push this. This is the 1830s and 40s. I should mention that Calvin Stowe pushed for these laws in Ohio. He was teaching at a seminary in Cincinnati. His wife was there learning about slavery across the river in Kentucky. And Calvin Stowe was pushing for these reforms in Ohio. And so we get this full, it was less successful in the South. Eventually it sunk in the South. But largely, especially as you go across the upper Midwest and in the mid-Atlantic states, this gets established in the United States. Now, what comes with this is an old Puritan idea of the foundations for society. Actually, it's an idea that then Yankees picked up on when Puritans were no longer Puritans, but they were still religious. The foundations for society are the school and the church. And if you look at New England towns, going back in history, what you'll find very often is you have a common village green in the middle where everybody meets, and there's a church on the village green, and there's a school. There's also a town hall very often, for government. But this is in New England, this is the belief of what makes culturally America tick. These are the foundations on which you build these things. And so, as you go through history, you find this being repeated in a number of places. Here is Starletown, New England. And here's the village green, and here's the church, and here's the school, and I don't know, there's probably a town hall in there somewhere. And you have, in the land ordinance, written by a Yankee, Rufus King, in 1785, when they're going to settle Ohio and lay out the grid that we see out there in the countryside, one piece of land, national law, was reserved for the public school. So you're going to have a school there also. They also encouraged a church to be built, but government didn't have to encourage that. People mainly just went and did it. Have you been to Talmadge, Ohio? Talmadge, Ohio, right, if you know about Ohio history, from here all the way to the eastern border of Ohio, northeast Ohio, Pennsylvania was the reserve, the western reserve. This was Connecticut land. And Connecticut claimed it, and a lot of Connecticut people migrated out here. My great-great-great-grandfather, Charles Case, moved to Turnbull County in the late 1700s. And it was, so Connecticut migrants, Yankees, settled here, and very often they copied what they had in New England. And a prime example of that is Talmadge. You've got a it's a wonderfully preserved village green in the middle, and you've got two institutions there, the church and the school. A very sort of Puritan or Yankee way of looking at things. And then this spilled over into other things. Here's a Civil War sort of political cartoon about emancipation. And this is a Republican northern view of things, all the terrible horrors of slavery. You emancipate the slaves, and look, they're going to vote. There's, I don't know, going to be prosperity. But look at this happy community. You've got the school with the flag flying over it, and the church. That's the vision that New Englanders, but abolitionists or anti-slavery people, but others in the North had. Other sort of visions is 1922. If things are falling apart, what's falling apart? Well, modernism is church on one hand, school on the other. This is from a fundamentalist magazine, feeling like all of America is going apart because it's tearing down the pillars of American society. But schools become very, very important. I like this one in Coshocton County in southeast Ohio, appropriately named Yankee Ridge. Yankees out here in Ohio, yes, and here's the Yankee school mom building the school, and Yankee missionaries and reformers who went south during Reconstruction after the Civil War. One of their primary goals, teach children of freed people to read and write. Common school movement spreads there. And of course, you know, that other great American foundation, Gunsmoke, the TV show, has the Yankee school mom coming and bringing civilization to the West. Calvin Stowe encouraged women, young single women, to go west and teach. I mean, this was really a real thing. And my grandmother, who was born in Indiana, went to a teacher's training school in Minnesota in about 1915 and became a teacher, then went on to North Dakota and taught in one-room schoolhouses. And then met my grandfather, and then she raised my mom, who took me to libraries. And so you have this process of Yankees all the way through. All right, I'm going to go through one last final conflict, because not everything is rosy and easy. I mean, these are great accomplishments that I've talked about. But we also need to talk about things like, you know, this event you all know about, the Elliott School Rebellion. No, you know, I didn't think you would know about this. Okay, here's the situation. It's 1859, Monday morning, March 7th. The teacher, a woman named Sophia Shepard, good Yankee school mom, asks 10-year-old Thomas Wall to stand up and recite the Ten Commandments. It was very common in Massachusetts school in the morning to recite the Ten Commandments publicly and out loud, maybe a Bible verse. Young Tommy refused. Well, this is a problem. So the next day, Tommy's father was called in. He had to meet with the principal and the school board, and they tried to convince Tommy's father that he should say the Ten Commandments, and Tommy's father refused. Said no, he's not going to say the Ten Commandments. The next Monday, Miss Shepard asked Tommy again to recite the Ten Commandments out loud, and again he refused, and the assistant principal came in and told the class he is going to whip Tommy unless he recites the Ten Commandments. Part of that Puritan tradition. He apparently thought Tommy was a fool, and idle fools need to be whipped. Maybe he's not idle, but he needs to be whipped. Tommy refused whipping. He had him hold out his hands, and he took a cane and beat his hands for 30 minutes. I mean, ooh, that was rough. Every now and then, the assistant principal would stop, and the boys would yell at Tommy not to give in. Don't give up, Tommy. Keep standing. The principal then ordered all the boys who would not recite the Ten Commandments to leave school. And 400 left. Wait, so what is going on here? Well, Tommy's father then sued the assistant principal for excessive force, and it went to trial. And the lawyer for the principal and the assistant principal said in the trial, "Who is this priest who comes here from a foreign land to instruct us in our laws?" You see, I've left something out. Why is Tommy refusing to do this? Thomas, or Tommy, I don't know if they called him Tommy. I call him Tommy because it's sweeter, was a Catholic. And for Catholics and the Ten Commandments, they have a different version of what the Ten Commandments, they count the Ten Commandments differently than Protestants count them. And the Protestant got theirs out of the King James Version, where they said the second commandment is, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, which for a Protestant is like those Catholics who have statues and, you know, all those pictures of Mary and so forth. But the Catholic version, number one, was thou shalt not have strange gods before me. That was part of commandment number one. And Thomas Wall had been going to a Catholic church where the priest was saying, you cannot recite the Protestant version because that is taking you away from the church. If you want it, the Catholic doctrine at the time was the people who can properly teach the Bible are ordained Catholic priests or other sort of Catholic authorities. But here you have this Yankee schoolmom who is Protestant, teaching a Protestant thing, so he encouraged the boys not to do it, and Thomas was encouraged by his father not to do it either. Now, I should mention something here that we might be tempted to think along a couple of things. First of all, we could say, these school people, they must be really, here we are arguing over really kind of a minor point of biblical interpretation and theology. Why do religious people get this way? And we also might be tempted to think that the school represents, you know, a really rigid, maybe sort of fundamentalist group of Americans, and Tommy and the Catholics represent the liberal, open-minded ones. And it's more complicated than that, I'm afraid. I like showing how life is more complicated. It bugs the heck out of my students. But, and here's evidence for us. This is a newspaper commenting on it. We are unalterably, sternly opposed to political and social Romanism, a type of Catholicism that's in society, as well as to its wretched superstition, intolerance, bigotry, and mean despotism, as much so as we are to the monster institution of human slavery, and for the same reasons. We are opposed to Catholicism in America for the same reason we are opposed to slavery in the South. It's the same thing. What? In other words, this is what you might call a liberal newspaper. Okay, let me just say this. You go back 100 years, you try to put conservative and liberal terms on things, a lot of times it just doesn't work at all. That's my main point. You have to get in the context of the time to see how we were thinking. But for many people supporting the school, it's because of this. Catholic immigration has risen greatly. You can see how much. Whoops. Wait. You know, from you know how many Catholics in America in 1820 there were 200,000. By 1860, there's 3.1 million. That is incredible growth. Almost most of it from immigration. And a lot of Protestants are saying, what is happening to the core of our country if you've got these Catholics coming in? Should Catholics achieve political power in the United States, our national government, now so fearfully subservient to the shameful slave power, would then be no less under the dominion of a standing army of priests and fathers. We'll be under the slavery of Catholic priests, just like in the South, everybody's under the slavery of the masters. This is from Dr. Arthur Buckminster Fuller, brother of Margaret Fuller, who was a transcendentalist writer from Concord. He's a Unitarian. These are liberal, religious, political people. But like I said, political categories don't work the same way. But they saw Catholicism. This is a time of strong anti-Catholicism because they thought Catholics are going to have a higher loyalty to the Pope and the Church than they are to the U.S. government and the Constitution. Well, it was a difficult situation. I should mention that Thomas Wall, there were lots of acts of anti-Catholicism, burning convents, and they had a riot in Philadelphia. You know, Philadelphia Bible riots? That's another story. A whole political party trying to keep Catholics out of the country. Thomas Wall became a hero among Catholics. They sent him medals and a goblet. Thomas Wall, the hero of the Eliot School. And a lot of the kids left and joined the priests who formed a Catholic school. Primary school, St. Mary's Primary School, which was kind of our way of resolving this tension. You're not happy with the public school, you actually are free to go and form a private school. And there may be, in this case, yes, a reason why you're not happy with the public school if you're Catholic, according to their doctrine. So, the school oftentimes also functions as sort of like ground zero of the culture wars. And we tend to link it, and I think rightfully so. I mean, education does a lot of things, but one of the things it should do is form good American citizens. But sometimes we have different ideas about what makes for a good American citizen. Interestingly enough, part of what the school board and the Yankees believed is you should respect authority. And the authority of the school says you should say the Ten Commandments this way. Well, if you're Catholic, you're like, yes, I respect authority. That's why I'm not saying that, because my Catholic teaching says I should follow this other thing. So they have a similar value there, but how you work it out, that can get trickier. So just a reminder, sometimes to take a deep breath and say, okay, what do we have in common here? And how can we resolve our differences over whatever conflict we are going on with school? But overall, I would say this then. If we go back to New England's contribution, mandatory education for kids, it's a good thing. It's not only a good thing for the kid, but overall, it's a good thing for all of American society. We need to think about this. I remember a letter to the editor when a tax levy came up. A single man says, I don't have any kids, so I didn't vote for this tax levy. Well, there might be a good reason to refuse to vote for the tax levy. That's not it. You should care about more than just yourself. You should care about, wait a minute, the question should be not whether you have kids or not, but what is good for wider society. And with that in mind, I think it would be good also to thank a teacher this week, because a lot of them, have Calvins to deal with and might be a bit discouraged. And so, you can go to a teacher. Thank you for the work that you have done in terms of, educating children, not only in knowledge, but hopefully a lot of character formation, hopefully good character formation goes on in schools also. All right, I went over a little bit because my forebearers were Yankees, and maybe they were related to John Adams, who talks a lot. I don't know. Thank you. But I do want to hear comments and observations from you, or questions if you want to. And John has a microphone so everybody can hear.
Let's see. New England, and especially Massachusetts and Boston, they had a tradition of high literacy rate, okay? Mm-hmm. So has that helped them in today's world? In other words, is the literacy rate in especially Boston or Massachusetts higher than the rest of the country like it used to be? And if it is, maybe that's something we can grab onto.
Right. I don't know what literacy rates are like in New England today and where it ranks. Actually, most of the country is really pretty high today. I do know this. One part of Puritan education that I did not talk about, because I knew I talked too much, I had to cut things out, is higher education. They also established Harvard in 1637, and for a long time, New England had a higher percentage of people who went to college and also performed really quite well in higher education. And, literacy is a foundation for that. And I think that, I don't know for sure whether, but I know that higher education is deeply embedded in New England culture. That's another part of the whole thing. And so I would be more comfortable saying that may be something that continues on today. But as far as literacy goes, there are differences, but from my understanding, the differences aren't that great. We mostly have near one. Some people will not learn to read because of intellectual disabilities or other sort of reasons. But so it's like it's a national success overall because of New England. That's maybe how I'd phrase that.
Yes. Would you address the issue of why so many colleges are in the Northeast?
Yeah, right. I mean, in New England, you see lots of colleges. You drive into town, and there's a college on one corner and a Dunkin' Donuts on the other, and you say, what is going on here? Well, education and donuts and coffee. But the New England, from the beginning, had many more institutions of higher education. I mean, you think about this, the Puritans started landing on the shores of New England in 1630. They built Harvard as a divinity school in 1637. They're still cutting down trees. You know, very early on. And then they build Yale and they build Dartmouth, several of the early Ivy League schools, and then lots of other liberal arts colleges, because they also emphasized we need a leadership that is highly educated and thoughtful also, not only in church, but also in government, but in other areas of American society too. And so that's a tradition that also carries over, and so many colleges and universities in New England, especially the small liberal arts tradition.
Parental choice. It doesn't sound like the idea of public education started with any parental choice.
Parental choice. No. Well, parental choice meaning we do have the choice to send our kids to a different school. We don't have the choice to say, my child isn't just not going to go to school or learn to read. So mandatory education, everybody has to go to school. But the tradition of, I mean, a lot of schools early on, well, okay, this is what's kind of complicated. In New England and elsewhere, the schools were both kind of public and private at the same time. They got state funding, but they were also kind of religious at the same time. What New England tried to do was what they called non-sectarian education. We need to teach religious values, but there will be religious values that are amenable to all Christians. But as it turned out, they weren't amenable to Catholics, but they thought they were. They're like, no, just say the 10 Commandments. The Catholics were like, no, you don't understand our theology. With that, I think what the tradition of choice oftentimes involves private schools. It really were Catholics forming separate Catholic parish parochial schools that in many ways is the start of this over religious differences, not only in New England, but in, here in Ohio and Pennsylvania and other places where there were a lot of Catholics. And so then later there's the question of, well, then what's the relationship between the public or the private parochial schools and government? Can government support them or not support them? And that's a long, tangled, complicated story that's still going on today that I'm not a big expert on, but I know there's a lot of ins and outs. Yes?
So throughout the past probably 20 to 30 years, we've seen fiscal public support for K-12 diminish, and then also higher ed. You know, higher ed used to be about 50% supported by the states. It's probably about 10%. Do you have a comment on that, or what we should be thinking and doing about that?
Oh, boy. That's a good question. That's sort of like a stump the speaker question. I mean, I have thought about this in a number of ways, and I'm not an expert on it, and what we can do about it. One thing that, and I think I'm in the minority on this position, on a deep level, I think one problem in our society is that when we talk about the highest goals and purposes of education, we turn to pragmatic things. And I think we would be better off if we talked about higher transcendent sort of things. So pragmatic sort of issues, I mean, I think mostly, if you ask most Americans today why go to school, it's so you get a good job. It's good for the economy. And I think that's important, and that is one of the things that education should be doing. But if you went back to the 19th century, there was a little bit higher purpose. They say you're training people of good character to be American citizens. And if you went back to the Puritans, you're saying you're training people to be really good character and be godly. It's good for the wider society. And I think that sometimes we don't advance too much beyond little Calvin, who says, I know enough as it is. I've got a job, what else do I need education for? And we have not done a good job of explaining, no, education is actually really does matter at this higher level. Now, will people buy that? I don't know. That's part of the problem because so much of our public funding and other sorts of things is based on the market, and the market is based on what people want, and a lot of times people want lower, what do I want to say, good things, but not better or best things. And so you want a minimal education. I mean, I don't know how helpful that is, but that's one thing I am concerned about is that we see the humanities getting cut back in higher education and now maybe in high schools all across the country. You know, literature and history and philosophy, it's seen as, you know, what do you need this stuff for? You know, it's not going to help you get a job, which actually it makes you a really smarter person. That's another little hobby horse. But I think that's a problem too, because those are the things that ask us to think deep questions and think about higher sort of transcendent issues that should concern everybody. It's a theoretical, abstract answer because I'm a professor. But part of it is a theoretical answer that says, the pragmatic's important, but you got to have these higher ideals that you instill in people too, I guess.
Thank you very much, Jay.
Thank you,
Thank you.
John.